What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis-tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Oddly enough, they don't list that particular event in their otherwise fairly detailed history. Disgusting. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man. And they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent undefined. To be specific, it was the corpse of Elmer McCurdy, the "You'll Never Take Me Alive" guy. The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s. They took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the U.S. back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. Oh. Kinda like the mother and baby home in Ireland. The New London School explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, TX, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this could never happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family. So I didn't really know too much about it other than the fact that he'd survived until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated. So my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his actually very interesting life, including a big section on the New London School explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. Papa was in 8th grade when it happened. In his English class at about 3:00 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time. And when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies and parts of bodies everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, He would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the second floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only two kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive, but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole. So Papa and the other boy started lowering the injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific. But I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. A few years later, my grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Peleliu and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw during the war was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Undefined. There is a small museum at the site of the explosion in New London. If you're ever out that way, I do recommend checking it out. It is very well done and incredibly moving. My grandfather's story, while amazing, is just one of many that day. A couple people mentioned the telegram from Hitler. Yes. It's there at the museum. This was a few years before he came into full power. But he was an up-and-coming political figure in Germany at the time. I looked it up online. The original is in German, but the translation reads, "On the occasion of the terrible explosion at New London, Tex, which took so many young lives, I want to assure Your Excellency of my and the German people's sincere sympathy. Adolf Hitler, German Reichschancellor." I don't know the details, but I do know from some things my grandmother said that Papa had some PTSD, both from the explosion and the war. We did get the recordings converted to digital files, which we have stored in several safe locations. A number of years ago I undertook the project of transcribing everything and putting together a book of my grandfather's total memoirs. In addition to the school explosion, he really lived a fascinating life. As a little kid, he was present for one of the most famous circus disasters of all time, the Corsicana Elephant Rampage. And he saw some of the fiercest action in the Pacific as an engineer for the Army Air Force during World War II. He also went from being the dirt-poor son of an oil field worker to a pretty successful salesman later in life. At the same time my dad went to graduate school, Papa decided to go back to school and get his master's as well, which led to a career shift to become a college professor. And he taught in both Louisiana and Hong Kong. He was really a very interesting guy. Sadly, he had his 2 strokes when I was pretty young. And he died when I was 14. So all of my memories of him are of a pretty ill man in a wheelchair. Working on transcribing his memoirs. I feel like I got to know him better after his death than I ever did in life. I am so thankful for that. I compiled the memoirs into a book that we published just for family members. In addition to my grandfather's personal photographs, he kept a camera with him all throughout the war. There are a number of pictures that I pulled from online. So we couldn't publish it as it is due to copyright issues. But maybe someday I will go back and reformat everything to submit to the Library of Congress or for wider distribution. You want a happy story about him to help counter the explosion? This is a good one. At the start of World War II, while he was in basic training, a girl named Kitty sent her brother Keith a goofy picture of herself splashing around in the creek behind their family farm in TX. The picture of Kitty caught the attention of Keith's bunkmate, Papa, who decided to write Kitty a smart alecky note of his own, jokingly criticizing her manners for showing her ugly bare feet in public. Kitty was not amused. She wrote him a scathing letter and received a very apologetic note from Papa in response. This began a written correspondence that continued throughout the war. Papa wrote faithfully from some of the most remote, dangerous locations in the Pacific. She sent him news of the home front and taunted him with descriptions of fried chicken dinners. He sent her pictures of crocodiles and told her of the orphan children he cared for after the liberation of Manila. When Papa came back to the U.S. in 1946, he made a trip out to the farm to see his old friend Keith and to finally meet Kitty face to face. That was on a Friday. They were engaged the following Wednesday and were happily married for over 50 years. Edit 2 for a typo. Edit 3, /the_essayist_8 brought this video clip to my attention. And it's a pretty good account of the event. There are first-hand survivor stories, including one quite similar to my grandfather's situation. Only this man traded seats with another student so that he could sit near the girl he liked. He survived. The other student did not. Worth a watch. But be warned that it's pretty heartbreaking. Having to carry a memory of a girl that died in my place because I was clowning around would peep me up for life. No wonder he didn't talk about it. Sadly but understandably, the girl's parents apparently very much saw her death as my grandfather's fault. That's a lot of weight for a 13-year-old kid to carry. But there are a lot of stories like that. There's a little museum at the site now. And I remember reading another account of a boy who traded seats with his friends so that he could sit next to a girl he liked. When the explosion happened, his friend was killed. The whole thing just devastated a generation of children.